SDs and Gs. From the support company of the SDs and Gs. Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry and
Oh, yeah.
And I was standing up, and there was kind of bush behind me, and I, being a officer, you always had the troops sit down and be comfortable, you see. And I was talking to him, and I didn't know there was a 17-pounder right behind me, and he saw a German tank cross, then he decided to fire on it. He was too far, but he didn't, I don't know if he scared the tank or not, but at least he had the, I got the full muzzle blast. So I've been deaf ever since.
Well, how's your hearing right now? Do you find you can hear me pretty well?
Well, pretty well, dear. I've got a lot of fancy stuff in my ears here. Okay, well, I'm George Andrew Bannerman. I'm 89 years old now. In the Army, I ended up as a captain, General Staff Officer, Class 3 in Ottawa, and on the General Staff. I had served. Oh, is anything else about anything? I guess I'd served from a buck private to a captain.
How old were you when you enlisted, George?
I was only about less than a year in active services and NCO, and then I was sent off to be officers training in Gordon Head, Victoria, in the spring of '42. And you see by the time that I was very late getting into the Army, and my brother Gordon had joined in 1940, and but my dad and I both went in '41, and so that was it. So I had dreams of being in the Air Force, and of course being in the small town of Saskatchewan. You had to be in Regina, because when they had the call, if you weren't there, they just put your name back down at the bottom of the list again. So I waited and waited and waited and waited, and then finally, of course, I was kind of ashamed that I was still in Canada. My brother was already overseas, and I'm still not doing a thing for the country. And my dad and I joined up about the same time.
Was that your primary motivation then, to serve the country?
Yes, oh, definitely. Yes, because my dad had been in the First World War, and we had been trained all the way along that he was a civilian, as I was. We're not professional soldiers, but when our country needs our help, that's our job as a citizen, to be part of it. And and that doesn't mean that you have to be in the service to be a part of that. You could be in some of the war industries or something like that, because a lot of very fine people did that. They weren't all in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. There was other things that happened. But certainly, I felt that that was one way I could do it. And my brother and my dad both had the same thing. So there's three of us in it. My mother had, I guess, some anxious times.
Did your father get overseas?
No, he didn't. He was on his way overseas. In northern Ontario, the old veterans got off to exercise, and there was an icy thing, and he fell and broke a wrist. And he was in a civilian hospital and was maltreated. They put a cast on his arm so tight that he was in agony, and he finally grabbed a pin off the nurse and jabbed it in his hand. Of course, there was no blood because it was cut off. But anyway, that's another story. He served until after BE Day.
On the home front.
And he was now, he was 56, he was 61 when he came on.
Is that right? How long did you train in Canada before you went overseas?
Oh, God, I was 41. I didn't go overseas till the fall of '43. So I had been 2.5 years fiddling around here in Canada, waiting to go over.
And what was your role while you were still here?
Well, I was mostly an instructor in basic training or in advanced training. Advanced training for the Vickers Machine Gun. Basic training was basic infantry training. I get to be a captain, which was at second in command of a training company. But I knew that if I couldn't go overseas as a captain, and so my colonel knew that I wanted to go overseas, so when I had the chance, I was able to revert to a lieutenant. And it probably wasn't a very smart thing, because it took me pretty near 2 years to get the third pip back. I don't know. It was
And a cut and pay.
yeah, and but I still got that was stuff. And then, of course, when the war was over, my colonel that I had reported to in the 1st Canadian Army headquarters had me go back to the UK with him, and then I worked for him in Ottawa with the general staff, and I spent there until the 1st of July, 1946.
The native soldiers that you were telling us about, did that happen while you were still at home in Canada?
Yes,
when
and
you
I
were
was
in a training role. Can you tell that story again, please?
Okay. Well, when I was a corporal in the Machine Gun Training Center at Dundurn, Saskatchewan, I had a single hut with a corporal. I was a corporal at the time. A corporal in one end, and I had room for about 36 soldiers. And I got these 36 native people, the Aboriginal people, and they had the basic training in Ontario, and they were treated not like Canadians. They weren't allowed to go to the wet canteen. And of course, our colonel was a very strong feeling if anybody was good enough to wear the uniform of Canada, he was good enough to drink a glass of beer with everybody else. And so these lads went to the beer parlor, and when it came time to go to bed, I'm a very cocky little corporal, and I go down the aisle, and I'm screaming at these guys who are all having a great time. And I said, get to bed, get to bed, get to bed, and all yelling and screaming. And this lad come up, and he grabbed hold of my chest, and he lifted me off the ground, cocked a big fist back, and he said, "Corporal, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "Nothing." And I really meant it, because I expected to get hit. The next morning he came and asked he wondered why he hadn't been put on a charge for handling an NCO. But I said, well, it is a special case, because you folks weren't used to having beer, and you're a soldier, and I'm not going to step in your way now. And from then on, every payday, he used to go with me, and we put these young lads to bed. He would just grab them up and put them up in their bunk, and this one on the bottom and the next one on the top. I never had any more trouble with those 36 guys before they left I guess they went overseas, most of them. But they were quite an experience. There was one man, I got a million stories, but anyway, one man was a tall chap from northern Manitoba, and he had remarkable eyesight, and we used to use him when we were out training people to disappear in a little bit of cover. And this big man, we'd turn our backs and give the chief, as we call him, a few minutes, and he would disappear right you couldn't find him. He had the natural way of getting around. And he could also shoot like nobody business. And so we're out in the range, and I've been boasting about how good a shot this man was, and he had a Vickers machine gun. He was sitting down behind the Vickers, and Major Robertson, peacetime PPCLI, he said to me, "Is this the man that's supposed to be the good shot?" And I said, "Yes, sir, he is." So there was a range flag about 1,500 yards away, and he's looking through his glasses, and he said to the chief, "Can you see that flag over there on the edge?" And the chief looks, and he said, "Yes, sir." Hit it. Now with a Vickers machine gun, you only fire in the general area. It's not a precision weapon, certainly at 1,500 yards. So he looked at it, shot a few, maybe half a dozen rounds. Major said, "You missed it." "I know I did, sir. I know I did." Makes a little move, fires another round, tears the flag off the post. The major just sucks off. he wasn't supposed to hit somebody at 1,500 yards, a little flag, you see. And he stayed then as, because he had a sick wife, as our duty sergeant, and he always used to raise and lower the flag. And normally any ex-soldier will tell you that when it came to lowering the flag, normally you didn't want to be caught there because you had to stand at attention for, maybe 10, 15 minutes. But this Chief Says, who became a corporal, he did it with such dignity, bringing down the red ensign, that everybody lined up around to watch him do it. He had the flag come down. When the last notes come out, it was folded up and handed over to the officer in charge. I never heard anything more about him after I left there. I don't know if he went overseas or what. The sad thing about the Army is it's different if you were with a unit, like my brother was or my dad. You had this kind of closeness of a unit. But I always seemed to be on the go somewhere else, And I didn't have that many dear friends that you would have had. I had a lot of friends, but not as close ones maybe.
So did you know anybody that when you were taking the trip overseas, were you just alone then?
Well, we went on of course I can't think of the ship now. Anyway, we went to Halifax, and we had, I was assigned a place as an officer, upstairs, and all of a sudden a U.S. Liberty ship broke down just outside Halifax, and they had 1,500 U.S. soldiers to come on. So that meant we had to go into a different location, and to get him on. And of course, immediately when you have American troops on, you have a dry ship. And I can still hear the old captain. He was a very old seaman, and with this beautiful ship. And he said, "I've just locked up my liquor cabinet, and because we can only drink Coke for the rest of the way, And he said, 'Sorry, folks,' and that's it. But we had these. There was about the Army show was on that ship, and Wayne and Schuster. And I've got a little story about them too. That Wayne and Schuster were hired by British American Oil Company, which I was working for after the war, and they were putting on a show in our building in Toronto, and for I forget some occasion anyway, maybe Bonds or something like that, and so I went in. They were resting, and those two guys I said, "I think maybe you and two fellows and myself were the only ones here who were on that ship going across the Atlantic that day." And so those two guys, if you had only seen them, they just put on a show right now. They had no warning, and then you got a real show. They could have put it on the air. It was fun.
Right.
But anyway,
would they put on a show a day?
Yeah,
when you were on the ship, or would they just have one
they
show?
put on a ship. The Canadian Army show was put it on one. And of course they were NCOs, so they couldn't go on the main ballroom, you see, and they could stand at the door, but because it was for officers and ladies, the women's side of the Army were in the big ballroom, you see. But when they came to put on a show, of course, the Army show was on, and they were, and they put on several shows in Northwest Europe too, and like the Navy show and those kind of things. They were quite wonderful. So.
Do you remember your time in England quite well? That you spent a lot of time in England training again, didn't you?
Well, I got to England, and the first thing I got to this first morning, I reported to an adjutant, and he looked at my records, and he said, "Well, Bannerman, you're not going anywhere. You're the officer now that's going to be here looking after air raids and stuff like that, and protection against chemical warfare." Well, I said, "Sir, I had a course when I was a corporal in chemical warfare, but I don't remember anything about that." Oh, he said, "Well, we'll send you down to the Canadian Training School." So down I go, and when I was there, I took the course in chemical warfare, and I came first in the class. And so they asked me to stay as one of the teachers. So he said, if you any thing, you have to go back to Aldershot. And I said, no, not really. And I lied a bit, you know. I didn't want to go back there. And so I ended up by teaching there for some time, and then I moved from there to Flamethrowers. And we taught gas and smoke and flamethrowers at this Canadian Training Center. Canadian.
Did all Canadian troops get trained in chemical warfare, or was it just a select few?
Well, it was about, we would get NCOs and junior officers from all the infantry battalions and all the Canadian Army, I guess. And the same way that the support company from each of the infantry battalions came down for flame training. Not all of them, because of course there was a limit to how much you did, because the flamethrowers were only really being developed, so that the folks who went to Italy never had any training in it at all. And but they found out that if you want to know, find a little bit about what happened in once we were in France, in Belgium and Holland, they decided that they would give flamethrowers to carrier-borne flamethrowers to the infantry battalion of the Canadian Army. And two of the lads from our place in Storrington, Sussex, went over, and they were wounded both in the same show. And crossing the Leopold Canal, they had the flamethrowers assigned on one side of the canal in the dark, and they fired over the top, and that's where how they got across the Leopold Canal. With practically no casualties on either side. And but both the two men were wounded there, and so I was sent over with another lad to go to 1st Canadian Army headquarters, and I served there until after VE Day. And I visited, well, I keep saying about 64 infantry battalions that I worked with, and of the Canadian and British Army, and the Poles, and the Dutch, mostly, practically all the Canadians that were in Northwest Europe. And when the 1st and 5th Division come up from Italy in February of 1945, I don't think they hadn't had the flamethrowers in Italy, and of course at that stage of the war it was so active we couldn't really spend much time helping them out, and so most of the units who were in the 1st and 5th didn't get much flame training. But in the most effective one, I think, at the end of the war was a French-Canadian unit, Regiment de Maisonneuve, and the last part of the war, the last month, they hardly had a single casualty because they used flame on every time, and the Germans come out just with their arms up. There was neither casualties on either side, and they were very effective. And so there's certainly a feeling today maybe that we're using something very cruel, but we had a medical officer of the Canadian Army who always wanted to find one of the enemy that might have been burnt with the flame. And we had strict instructions that we were to report anybody that we found that way. We never did find anyone. Because after all, if you used the flame properly, you had them down, heads down with lots of fire, got in close to the flamethrower within 100 yards, fired the flamethrowers, out came the enemy with their arms up. We never had anybody shoot back at us.
It was meant to deter rather than destroy.
That's right. It was a marvelous, the most effective weapon that we had. I have a little story about the Regiment of Maisonneuve. After the war, you know, there was tens of thousands of unarmed German soldiers in northern Holland and northwestern Germany, and they were just They were just wandering around, and they were getting into mischief. And one of the mischief they did was put tripwires across the roads, and you were driving along in a Jeep and you lost your head, you see, because this tripwire was a steel cable. It just cut your head off. And of course we'd already said nobody rode bikes because the bike was so easy, so it could be, and we didn't want men to be killed after the VE Day. So the Maisonneuves had charge of a whole bunch of these German lads who were unarmed, and they got them around the lake in the nice night, and they fired flamethrowers over the lake. It's very spectacular, and the colonel had arranged for an interpreter to tell the German lads that if there was one more tripwire found the next day, they would turn the flamethrowers on. Of course, that was just a bluff, but you weren't going to shoot anybody at that stage of the war. And they were all very busy that night, and we never had any more tripwires. So it was the end of that one.
George, when was flame first used? Was it used in World War I at all?
Yes, there were. Yeah, mostly by the Germans.
Who developed flame?
I think mostly the original ones were developed by Germans. But the Canadian one, the ones we used, were developed by the British, but were hardly used by the British Army themselves. It was Canadian lads that used them, in most cases. And because, and I got one little story about that, is that they were still developing these flamethrowers, and the ones we had, the Wasp, had a range of about 150 yards maximum, so effective, about 100 yards. And I guess I should say less than 100 meters, I guess. And but I went over just before VE Day, and I was at the place where the English backroom people were developing a flamethrower, and I stood 200 yards in front of a flamethrower, and he shot over my head for a quarter of a mile. So that was the kind of flamethrower. And my buddy, he became Major Sorensen, Captain Sorensen, that I served with. He stayed in the Army after the war and was at the Camp Warfare place in eastern Alberta. And he and his crew developed a new flamethrower, and he got a very big settlement from the Defense Board for his work, in which he spread around the men who worked on. Very, very fine flame. But it's disappeared. You don't hear anything about it at all.
They don't use flame today.
No. Most of the people, and of course, like the lads that were in Italy, they didn't use it, you see.
Were you alone in your field when you were teaching the soldiers to use flame, or did you have a team?
I had a team. I had a team with a W02, a sergeant, and a corporal. So there were 4 of us. And the other crew, there's 2 crews, Captain Sorensen and Captain Bannerman. And we each had 3 NCOs with us. And we traveled all around wherever we were needed. And usually when a unit was out of the line, we would talk to them, and we also checked over their flamethrowers if they had mechanical problems and helped them out. I got to tell you a story here. I'm sorry, but I was working with a British battalion, and a very, very pompous major. And in the field, you didn't salute officers just one rank above you. You might salute a colonel if you really was, pushed into it. But this man, I saluted him about a dozen times, I think. And my 3 guys were working on a Bren gun carrier about 50 yards away, and all of a sudden I hear my name, George! And I saluted the major, and off I went. And so my 3 guys and myself were, our strength was the fact that the 4 of us knew more than any one person. That is the case. We were a team. And my W02 said to me, he said, I think we got this solved, but we just needed one more look. So I looked at it and I said, yes, you've done it. That looks good to me. So I go back and I salute the major. And he kind of gave me a half salute, not a very nice one. And he said, do you let your NCOs call you by your first name? I hadn't thought of that. And I said, well, sir, we're a very close team. But he said, it's a hell of a way to run an army, and stopped off. So that was it.
You also knew General Rockingham in World War II,
that
didn't
was
you?
one of the finest soldiers we had. He was one of the greatest, I think. Anyway, somehow or another, he heard about me, and I was down near his brigade. And he was such a wonderful soldier. He was always close to where the action was. Sometimes I think too close. But anyway, he was. And he said, Bannerman, anytime you're in my area, you're to come and see me and tell me what you've learned about flamethrowers since the last time. I said, yes, sir. And I did salute him, and I took off. The next time I come back, there's a war going on in his brigade. And there's people running around, and everybody, radios are screaming, and dispatch riders riding and everything like that. So I took off for 2nd Division headquarters because I had to go check there. And I got in the building they were, and the G1, that's the senior officer, below the boss. He said, Bannerman, what in the hell did you do with Brigadier Rockingham? He's on the phone, and he's just blistering the phone. So I turned around, and with my 3 guys, we drove back down to the brigade, and I go very meekly into his caravan, and I'm standing very close to attention. And he said, Bannerman, do you know what an order is? I said, yes, sir. The hell you do, he said. The hell you do. And then he kind of settled down, and he said, okay, sit down, George. And we had a little chat. I thought it was so typical of one of the finest soldiers Canada ever had, that cared enough about a guy like me, with a very junior rank, that I might know something that he could use. And that's the way he treated all his staff. He was just a fine man. And but I thought I was going back to Canada as a buck private, for sure.
After that incident.
Yeah. But anyway, he was too big a man. Once he got it off his spleen, he just tore a strip off me, and I'm shaking in my boots, you see, standing rigidly at attention. And then he said, sit down, George. I knew I was so safe then.
Do you think the other Allied countries used flame in the same way that we did?
Pardon me?
Do you think the other Allied countries used flame in the same way that we did?
Nobody used it as well, the British had the Crocodile, which was a tank that pulled the flame fuel tank, but they didn't seem to use it very much, and it was an ideal weapon. We had a tank that wasn't used in service anymore because it's kind of thin, and we took the turret off and put flamethrowers in it, and of course we could move. See, the carrier was such a thin-skinned little thing, even a rifle bullet would go through the little bit of armor there's there. And but the tank, we call them Badgers, and they were quite effective, but we didn't have very many of them. But most of the war, we used the Wasp in as Bren-gun carrier.
And you never saw other countries using flame?
No, I don't think I knew. The Germans, I think the biggest thing was that they might have used flame in the early part of the war, but they were so short of petroleum products that they probably didn't use it. Because as far as I know, we never run across. We did run across the odd flamethrower that had been left behind, especially the ones they carried on their back. One of the worst times that I was the most scared, I think, probably the most, was going on the causeway to Walker Island, and the Calgary
The
troops
Highlanders?
were there. That's one of their. They were pretty badly chewed up there. I've been told that there was a German ammunition dump there that had a German flamethrower in it. So somebody had reported this, so I go up there, and of course there's, well, to quite afraid is all hell was going on. There was an 88 across the other side in Walker, and was firing into the Calgary boys, and I was in an ammunition dump, which is not exactly the place you want to be when they're being shelled. And I was so darn scared. I ran into a kid from Swift Current who was a sapper, and he was disarming German shells in that thing. And I didn't think that I could even talk straight because I was so scared. These shells were coming over pretty regular, and I thought all he has to do is just move a little bit, and I'm right in the place with all this ammunition. And finally I said to this, I found the flamethrower, by luck, but we already knew about it, so I didn't do it anymore. And I went to this sapper, and I said, where's your sergeant? Where's your report to? And he told me, and I said, well, you go back and get out of this place. This is not the place that you should be disarming shells. I'm sure he's forgotten about you. Give him my name and tell him that I sent you out, because I don't want him to get in trouble, you know. I never saw him again, but that is all right. He must have been okay. But it was, and I got out of there too, because I was so darn scared. I was sure all this German ammunition and one of it, you know, go off. And I was scared easily anyway, I guess.
There was another story you were telling me about where you had a narrow miss.
Oh, we're going, this is after, we were going over to Walker Island after it was cleared. And I was asked to report to the Dutch brigade who wanted to learn something about flamethrowers. And so just my W02 and I, and he was driving the vehicle, and all of a sudden, he was driving the right-hand side, and I saw this V1 coming down, and I screamed my head off, you see, and it went into, because there was all this flooding, and it drove in under power, and then blew up, of course, and just splashed mud and all over the place, and we weren't scratched. And
how far away did it land from you?
Well, it wasn't very far. The noise was quite strong. And we got some mud on our vehicle, and there was a Dutch farmer with a single horse and a two-wheel cart, and he was just covered with mud and wasn't hurt, just a mud and mess. It had gone right into the ground and blown all this dirt and mud and everything on. And he was safe. We saw he was okay, and we just kind of said, carry on. And we went on. And my driver, of course, my W2, hadn't seen the thing at all because it was on my side, you see. And he wondered why I was screaming.
What all the fuss was about.
Yeah. But when the explosion went off, of course, he knew there was something close. The other one was, I had a second one in my corporal. We were in a Bren gun carrier going north out of Antwerp. And in Belgium and Holland, they all had interurban tracks running right alongside the highways. And we were taking our carry up, there was a big display for the Allied brass, Canadian, British, and American, and we were taking up this Wasp flamethrower to show off on it, and he ran it too close to the track, and he threw a track. And I'm giving Johnny Elliott a bad time for throwing a track. We're going to be late, and all of a sudden a V1 lands in front of us. And we'd have been right under it, I think. I wouldn't be here telling the story if it had been much further. So Johnny said every time afterwards he said, just remember, George, you know, the last time you get after me, I saved your life. Yeah, that's great.
Isn't that something? So you were talking about how you were sent to train the Dutch brigade. So the other Allied units were certainly attempting to learn about flame, but they never got quite a handle on it like
That's
the
right.
Canadians
I didn't
did.
think so. Yeah, it was I beg your pardon. The United States used pack-mounted ones, especially in the Japanese War. But they didn't have anything that had the range or they made the fuel on the spot where our fuel was made in the UK and shipped over, and it was it had this good range of about 150 yards, and I think there's a picture there even in that CATM.
And you were saying too that you were very careful about how you used it.
Yes, we think so. Because it was a short-range weapon, if you're using flame, you had to have enough firepower to get the enemy to have their heads down and quit firing at you, because you had to get this little Bren gun carrier, which is, a walking coffin if you got hit, and you had to get them close enough to be able to fire. But once we fired one shot, that was probably all it needed. They just come out.
They were terrified of it.
They were terrified, yeah.
How did our soldiers respond to using the weapon?
Well, I think we try to teach them that could be used. You had to get close, and then when you fired it, you'd expect it to come out this way. And so, I don't think I ever ran into a trained gunner who ever saw a man killed by it. Now, I'm sure they probably did, but I never found one, because I was supposed to find that. And I asked, after the VE Day, I went over the whole Canadian Army to every infantry battalion and the motor battalions, and asked their support company people about the use of flame. And I talked to each and every one of them, and I made a report which should be somewhere in the business that hasn't been thrown out. I don't have a copy, but it's...
The interesting thing is that your experience is really in direct contrast to how most people, I think, would think flame was being used.
That's right. Well, I think so. I think a lot of folks there that I see at the museum, I think they're quite shocked that I was a flamethrower. And I feel that I can understand that if you're dealing like with Afghanistan, where they're not in uniform, that you don't know who is the farmer and who is an enemy. They're probably all enemies, but you don't know. And whereas against the Germans, they were all wearing uniforms. And so we knew that they were the enemy. And if you use flame, they quit. And surely that was a good way for both sides. Neither man lost his life. I think it was a great one.
So, to wrap it up, George, World War II is thought of as the only just war. How do you feel about your contribution when you look back?
I kind of think that I had a very small part in it, and I think that for a scared prairie kid, I think I saved a few lives. And I think that if all the time that I was so scared, I think it's quite, I really never seen anybody that wasn't. And, but the thing is that what your training does, you continue to operate, even though your knees are shaking. No one seems to know, like that sapper who was doing the trees, I saw him later on. He said, "George, you're the bravest guy I've ever seen." I said, "You're looking at the biggest coward in the Canadian Army." Well, he said, "You were talking there just like we were back in Swift Current." But it was just a case that you're so frightened. And but if you're trained properly, you still do your job. I think that's it. It's not always pleasant, but you did it. And I think that flame, I don't feel badly about it, is because I think we saved a lot of lives on both sides with the proper use of it. And The Maisonneuves, in fact, at the end of the war, they were a very poor battalion in the early stages. They were chewed up very badly in Canfalais. But at the end of the war, the last month, I don't think they had more than 1 or 2 casualties because they used flame every day that they were in battle. And they did it right. And so when the war was over, they called me down to the Maisonneuves, and I had an honorary mess dinner put on for me by the Maisonneuves, thanking me for what I'd done with them. But I said to them, I don't deserve any of it. You're the folks that did the job, not me. Well, they said, you taught us, but I said, that's not really the king. The thing is that you did it. And they were just so proud. And the Maisonneuves were a French-speaking unit who, during the war, all learned English. They took very pride in it. I have a little sad story about that. I was with the Maisonneuve one day, and I just had mail from home, always a letter from my mother. And I'm sitting there reading, and this buck private, young kid, sitting beside me, and he said, is that a letter from your mother? And I said, yes. Well, he said, you know, I have been over here, my folks are illiterate, and I haven't had a letter from my mother or father since I've been in the army. And I said, well, you're learning English. How can you read my mother's writing? So I hand over the letter. By the time it's done, the tears are running down his cheek. And you know, the thing, I've never forgiven myself. I didn't get his regimental number because my mother would have written. And I didn't do it. I got darn fool I didn't do it. And I've never forgiven myself. I can't do it. But I just thought of that kid crying. You never saw crying lads, not very often. I can tell you one time that I did on V Day, on May the 10th, I had a bottle of champagne that I had been liberated from the Germans and liberated from the French, I guess, and I'd been saving it for quite a while. And so it was a drizzly rain. I went in an open jeep about to where the Regina Rifles were, and a very good friend of mine who graduated the same time as I did at Gordon Head, Dick Roberts, who's now a major, a company commander. And we sat on a hill in West Germany in a bit of a drizzle, drank champagne out of tin cups, and cried quite a bit, because now was the time to cry. You know, that's it.
How did it feel coming home after all of that emotion and experience? Did anybody at home understand what you'd been through?
Well, great relief, of course. In fact, I don't even remember coming across the Atlantic. I remember going across the first time the other way, but coming home, we come into New Amsterdam, and I don't really remember very much about that trip. But because I got home, and then I was back working at Ottawa for the next 8 or 10 months. And then, of course, I went off to school.
Must have been strange getting back to the life as you knew it.
Yeah. And we were all, Gordon, of course, was my brother Gordon. The 5th Division was the last one home, you see. And I got home with the 1st Division because I was going to go to work. In fact, I was been selected to go to Japan if we needed to. And of course, the war was over before that happened. And I got home. Gordon didn't get home until the 5th come home about March of 46. They were the last ones home.
Did you ever see your brother when you were overseas?
Oh yes, I was in Nijmegen. I was billeted in the school, and of course, we knew. My colonel told me that he said, "Did you hear from your brother?" And I said, "No, not normally, because he writes home, and my mother sends a message to him." Oh, he said, "Don't be surprised if you hear from him." So I just let it go, and of course, well, I come in one day and I see that my little cubby hole I was in, it looks like if somebody'd been around there. And of course, then I've seen a note from my brother in his terrible handwriting saying that they were hit in now and they'd come up from Italy. And great excitement to see all this guys. We hadn't seen each other for a long time. And of course, we all got together. There's a picture of when my mother wanted all her family back together again. So we all had a picture taken in after Gordon was up. And I was still, well, I guess I was in city clothes.
Your mother was one of the lucky ones.
Yeah.
She had you all back.
And you know, and in this, and she worried, I'm sure. But you know, on the first one, she was married in December the 17th, 1917. My dad went back. Passchendaele took place, and he was posted missing, believed killed. And he was decorated with an MM after that show. He was a stretcher bearer who shouldn't have been in the front lines because he had a rheumatic heart. But he spent that. The second war, I think she might have had quite a bit of worry, but I don't think, Gordon always said, one thing he said if you read his memoirs, that when he got in the slit trench beside his guns at night, he pulled his ground sheet over top of him, and he always said, I'm home, I can just relax. And he never hit there. There were close ones, but it was never hit.
Like so, putting a little halo around himself.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Whereas that, I don't know, maybe he was scared too. I never really got that in me. But I know I was.
Must have been a great relief to get home.
Oh, it was, yeah. It's a great thing. And then, of course, I think the one marvelous thing that happened was that after this war, the Canadian people gave me the opportunity to go to university. And I got my degree in chemical engineering in 1950.
By that time, you had a pretty good resume.
Yes, okay. Yeah. How's that?
That was great, George. Thank you very much. Now it's all over. Edit me out when you're ready.
Well, he came out to Canada in 1905 and then homesteaded at south of Swift Current in 1908. And then when the war came, he went into Swift Current, but he had rheumatic fever, and the doctor there said, you can't get in the service. So Dad said, okay, and went back to his farm. In 1915, he came to Calgary thinking that he might get in without the doctor knowing. And of course, they found out he had a little bit of an enlarged heart, but they got him in. But they said, you can't do any fighting, we'll put you as a stretcher bearer. But he spent all his war in the trenches just like anybody else. And he has some great stories, and of course there's other ones that are probably common to every stretcher bearer. He said that there was 4 men, you see, carrying a stretcher because they had to carry him quite a ways back, and they were all of a sudden they got under shelling, and the guy that was on the stretcher bearer just took off and run. They'd carried him already for about half a mile, and they just took off and run because he was so scared. But anyway, he probably had a memory right to be. But anyway, this story that Gene was telling about being in Passchendaele, and there was so much mud there. It was just nothing but mud. And many thousands of men were buried in the mud. And he got up on the top to relieve himself. And during the night, the Germans had moved their trenches closer to theirs. And he looked down, and he looked right into the eyes of the German soldier with a rifle. And my dad thought he was dead. And the German lad just shook his head. And Dad went back. In other words, he was a human being he couldn't kill face to face. Now, he hadn't been like the SS would have shot him anyway. But nothing. This was a normal, because in the Second World War, my experience was that I had a very good friend of mine who was captured by the Germans and by an infantry battalion, and he was a sergeant, and the sergeants all looked after each other, they looked after. but then he was escaped from them with a little assistance from them, I think, and he ran into some SS and they beat this tar. His back was all, you just run your fingers down. They don't break the skin. They were very clever. And then, of course, the war was over. He'd been one of my sergeants in Canada, so very special lad. But it was a case the SS come in and killed his wounded. He was when he gave up. The regular troops that captured him looked after him fine, but the SS came in behind and shot all the wounded.
That's traumatic.
Yeah, they were kind of inhuman. But in the First World War, then, let's see. My dad.
The Germans were a bit of a different breed in the First World War.
Well, yes, because they didn't have these SS type things, I think, and. On Christmas time, they weren't supposed to stop fighting, but they always did. And the men would get out and trade their parcels that they'd got from home and have a great old time, split a beer or a drink of some kind and chocolates or so on. And of course, the officers who were sitting back about 40 miles back, where they were in the First World War on both sides, were dead against us. They didn't care about these poor devils that were in the trenches from the mud and the filth that we were putting up with. They sat and they drank their good booze and the nice meals. It was a terrible way. You see, this is the difference between Rockingham. Rockingham was a soldier's soldier who was right with the soldiers. In fact, we all thought he was too close to being killed. We don't want a man like that killed. You want to keep him But he was such, and not because he was horribly brave. I'm sure he may have had shaken knees too. But in the First World War, it is terrible. They sat back in their shadows and sent over the men over the top into the machine guns. Thousands of them. Just I think that a little bit, I don't necessarily want this published, but I think a little bit of the British thing was still around in the Second World War, where the officer was looked after first. See, when I was a junior officer, I never sat down until my men were all looked after. They were fed and watered and got a place to sleep. Then I could sit down. In the British Army, the first thing the officer did was sit down and he was looked after. And then the guys did. So it's a different story.
Quite a difference between the way the Canadian Army functioned in World War II and from the British mother country. Yeah.
The thing is that, and what I found about the British Army in the Second World War was I went with, of course my background is Scottish, and so the 51st Highlanders, there's, a lot of family tree have been in the 51st. Mm-hmm. And I'd always dreamt of meeting some of them, but when I did see it, they had been chewed up in the desert and dear knows what all. They were just filled with recruits that didn't have any of the spirit, and they had no spirit left at all. The British, after VE Day, there weren't much spirit left. They've been chewed up too often. And I tell you another thing, that we had a lot of British police, and if you saw, we had an HUP vehicle, and normally a lot of the roads were saved for jeeps and staff cars, but they're usually a quick way of getting somewhere, and so Joe and I and our four of us, we'd like to use these roads, but there would be, if there's a Canadian MPs in front of there, we never tried to go on them. But if there's a British one, Joe had his warrant officer here, and I had my 3 pips, but we always drove without rank showing. And if it was a British MP, we just kind of moved our things around his head, and they let us go through. if you went up to a Canadian one, he just told you, you get, and I'll shoot you if you don't. And so we never argued with him. We went around. But it wasn't very nice of us taking advantage of these lads. But I'm sure it helped us get someplace quickly. And of course the British always stopped for tea. And you'd be going along on a main road like Maple Leaf Up, which is always the main road in our area. And all of a sudden the traffic would all stop and it's tea time. They're all brewing a cup of tea. The war stopped for tea.
Isn't that funny? I heard that about the Punjabi regiments too, that they would always stop for tea.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's too bad.
Caused some real traffic jams.
Yeah, oh, terrible traffic jams. I have one story about, so much of Holland was flooded, and they had dug in a Tiger tank at a cross intersection where there was water on all sides. And there was just a kid of about 14 with these lots of ammunition for the 88. He held up the whole 2nd Division for 2 days. We dive bombed him, we shot him, but you know that Tiger was such a well-built tank, and it was just the gun showing, and he had lots of ammunition. And after pounding him with everything, airplanes, and the kid come out crying, and he turned out he was only 14, but he held up the whole 2nd Canadian Division for 2 days.
And he came out crying.
But he was just, he was just helpless. He was just, he'd been beaten. He had so much noise and crashing, and I'm sure he thought he was going to die. But anyway, he came out with his hands up.
But it took him 2 days to surrender.
Yeah.
What a story.
Yeah, we didn't see, because of my job, I didn't see many German people, you know. Saw them in, I remember when the first ones I saw were in a prisoner of war camp, just a bunch of barbed wire around, and it was pouring rain, and there must have been half a dozen lads standing in there, you know, and they were quite happy to be captured, you know, because they knew they were going to get fed, and not badly treated either. But they hadn't been moved back yet, and they were still in the. But I never heard of anybody abusing them. I only know of one case that one of my guys, my corporal, went in with a commando, and the commandos normally didn't take prisoners, and this man come out of this place with it, and he was shot by these W1. And my lad said to him, well, why did you kill him? He was coming out. Oh, he said he probably had a grenade in his hand, which is probably, maybe it was, I don't know. I think that, hate becomes a terrible thing. And if you can just shoot your fellow man, and like the man in World War I that couldn't shoot my dad when he had a perfect opportunity, because he just shook his head.
He'd seen enough killing.
Yeah.
Did you know any of the Calgary Highlanders during the Battle of the Walcheren Causeway?
Yeah. Well, they were just being pounded into the ground. Terrible. I don't know why. The whole thing is that clearing those things was a fault of pride of Montgomery, who should have cleared the Germans out of there to clear Antwerp. But no, he wanted to go to Berlin. And so they turned and went the other way. And it was left to the Canadians to clean that up. And the Calgary Highlanders took an awful beating there. I can see at 88 was just crashing. And of course I was so scared. I was so glad to get out of it. I don't think I've ever.
We're at 1 minute. Well, maybe we'll close now, George. We've come to the end of the tape, and
okay.
Thank you so much. It was just great.
But you've had a lot of talking from this old man.
It's perfect. It's just the way we love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you,
Well,
George.
thank you very much,
Thank
both
you.
of you, for